All right, we've made it to session 5, and hopefully, as we've made it to session 5, you're enjoying your time with your small group. Maybe there's the one annoying person that's talking too much, and you know who you are. But besides that, I'm sure it's been a great time for your group, and I'm sure it's been a great time for everybody there. And I hope that you're enjoying what God is doing, and I hope you're taking the time to talk to one another and pray for one another, and that this is encouraging for you as you and the other people in your group consider how God is calling you to care for the fatherless. I told you whenever I began these videos that my goal is just kind of try to recreate what it might look like if you just came into my office and said, Daniel, tell me what you think about orphan care ministry, and I might walk you through some of the components of the book together. And that's true for this topic as well. The topic today that we're looking at is when not to care for orphans. When not to care for orphans. And if you were coming to my office and we were talking about whether or not you should or should not care for orphans, and I saw some things that concerned me, I would want to make sure that my conversation with you was very gracious, that I was very encouraging, and even if I had some hard things to say, I said them in a way that affirmed you and demonstrated my love and my care for you as someone that I know. Very likely I don't know you, or at least many of you that are watching this or doing this study with your group. And so I may say some hard things that may sound kind of cold or distant, and I hope it doesn't come across that way. And I hope that there are other people in your life that you can talk through these things with, other people in your church, to kind of analyze these things. So my point is that one of the difficulties in a church's orphan care ministry is that sometimes as a person feels called to care for the orphans, and they begin exploring what's going on in their lives, and hopefully that's taken place through this small group Bible study, they begin to see some things that give them pause, or maybe give others around them pause, and make them think, well, maybe I'm not where I thought I was spiritually, and maybe I'm not ready to care for orphans. Or maybe the type of ministry that I thought I was going to be going into, I'm really not prepared for that at all. When a church begins an orphan care ministry, it faces the very real possibility that it's going to have some difficult conversations with people and say, you know what, we know that you want to adopt, but your marriage is on the rocks. You know, it's not a good time for you to adopt, and you're thinking, perhaps if I adopt, this baby's going to save the marriage, and no, that's not a great way to view adoption, of course. And so again, all I'm saying is that a church needs to be prepared to have difficult conversations with people about when not to care for orphans. Let me just give you kind of 4 examples of when a person should not care for orphans. And I'm not saying that these things mean that a person should never care for orphans. I'm just saying if these things are true of your life, you need to kind of step back for a moment, evaluate why you're engaged in this ministry, and then if God allows, to continue to pursue orphan care ministry under the guidance of some spiritual leadership. Number 1, don't care for orphans if you're practicing idolatry. Okay? Again, I'm going to say that kind of hard, but hopefully you understand my spirit in saying this. Don't care for orphans if you're practicing idolatry. Some people have made an idol out of having children. Some people have made children an idol. And the desire to have a child is so great, is so overwhelming, that it's become an idolatrous desire. The book of James describes idols of the heart and how our actions reveal what's within our heart, what our idols are. He says, this is James chapter 4, verse 1, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions, you adulterous people. And so what's happening here to the people that James is writing to is that they're involved in these arguments, there's tension, there's strife, there's quarrels. And he says the reason that there's these arguments is because of what your heart wants. Your heart wants something, it's not getting it, and therefore it leads to these behaviors. I'd encourage you, if you're currently pursuing an adoption, for instance, examine the way your heart is responding to this journey. Do you find yourself angry at immigration? Do you find yourself angry at the paperwork you have to fill out and those officials in a different country who are so slow? Or do you find yourself angry at a birth mother or angry at a doctor or officials? Do you find that you're impatient with people? That's a sign that you're beginning to practice idolatry instead of worshiping God through this ministry. Our idols become manifest by our behavior. And so I'd encourage you, if you sense in your heart that you've made an idol out of children, or you've made an idol out of this perfect picture of the family that you desire, or the certain type of way you want your adoption to go, if you notice that that's become an idol, repent of that. Here's what James says in James 4, continuing. He says to respond this way. He says, do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit that he's made to dwell in us? But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Verse 8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. The remedy to idolatry is humility. As we are filled with pride, we decide we're going to worship what we worship, and we're going to behave in a manner consistent with our desires, and so we practice idolatry, wanting what we want, doing what we do because we want what we want, as some have put it. God calls us to humble ourselves, to worship God, and to allow the fruit of the Spirit to flow from us, the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control that God calls us to. That's the first thing. Don't care for orphans if you're currently practicing idolatry. Number two, don't care for orphans if you haven't properly counted the cost. In Luke 14, Jesus says some hard words to people who are considering the path of discipleship. In Luke 14, verse 22, Luke 14, verse 25, it says, now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and doesn't hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. In other words, as these crowds begin to follow Jesus and want to call themselves his disciples, who want to be formally recognized as followers of Jesus, he says, look, here's what you need to understand. The terms of my discipleship are incredibly high. It's going to cost you family relationships. It's even going to cost you your very life. Caring for orphans is one of the most difficult ministries you could ever undertake. And sometimes I've sat here with people and we've talked a little bit about orphan care ministry, and I've told them it's going to be difficult, and they hear me say, yeah. Or I've said, look, you don't understand. This is going to be really, really hard. And moms, sometimes you're going to struggle with knowing whether or not you really love this child that you've adopted, for instance. And the moms say, yeah. And then, a year later, they come back to our committee, the orphan care committee, and they say things like, why didn't anyone tell us it was going to be so hard? Don't care for orphans if you haven't counted the cost. And I encourage you, in your small group time, talk with one another about What are the potential costs that caring for the fatherless can require of you, can exact from you? Number 3, don't care for orphans if you're doing so on your own strength. Don't care for orphans if you're doing so on your own strength. I'm sure you're all very wonderful and beautiful and capable people, and you're able to do a lot of things simply based on the talents that God has given you. Don't rely upon those talents to do the work of ministry. Paul says in Philippians 2:13, it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. The believer who's doing God's work does so because God has transformed him or her and allowed her to have this desire to do ministry, and then has equipped the believer with the resources necessary to do the ministry. So there's both the willing, the desire to do the ministry, and the ability to do the ministry, that both come from God. One of the dangers that people who get really into a ministry face is wanting to do that ministry on their own strength, on their own power. Don't engage in caring for the fatherless if you're doing so on your own strength. I encourage you to talk through that as well with your small group and think through, what does that look like to do ministry by God's power versus doing ministry on my own strength? Could be a very interesting discussion. Then fourthly, fourth time not to care for orphans is if you're facing discontentment, if you're struggling with discontentment. And this is related to what we talked about earlier with idolatry, but listen to what Paul says later in Philippians chapter 4. He says, I'm not speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, often becomes like this rallying cry to excel at sports, right? What it's really calling us to do is engage in suffering. I can suffer all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if right now you find yourself in life very discontent, you say, you know what, I'm discontent with my spouse. I'm discontent with my job. I'm discontent with my church. I'm discontent with this video I'm listening to right now. If those things are all, if your life is just marked by discontentment, this may not be the best ministry for you, because caring for the fatherless isn't going to solve your lack of contentment. Contentment begins by finding joy in the Lord. Philippians is very clear on that. And sometimes people think, okay, right now my life isn't complete. I'm not content. I don't have the children I want. I don't have the paperwork filled out that I want to for my orphan care project, my adoption, my whatever. Once I get that done, then I'll be content. And my encouragement is for you to step back and say, you know what? There's a lack of contentment here that doesn't reflect the Spirit of God within me. A great thing to do in your small group time might be to talk with people who've been through an adoption or have been through whatever orphan care ministry you're feeling called to, and ask them, okay, how did you struggle with contentment, and what did you learn about God through that process, and what would you encourage me with now as I face the potential discontentment in the future? Well, of course, my hope and my desire would be that each of you care for the fatherless, but my encouragement is also to just take a step back and say, you know what, there may be some things in my life that I need to address first under the guidance of some accountability in my church or people who love me, or family members, before I engage in this very, very difficult but very joyful ministry of orphan care.